It was a Saturday morning, the kind of day where everything felt calm and predictable. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow over the countertop where I was preparing breakfast. Pancakes. Lily's favorite. I hummed softly to myself as I flipped the batter in the pan, the smell of cinnamon filling the air. James was already downstairs, in the living room, playing with Lily. I could hear their laughter drifting through the house, the sounds of a family that seemed content, a family that I thought was whole. James had always been patient with Lily, especially after the messy divorce from her biological father, Mark. I met James when Lily was just 3 years old, already aware that her biological father wasn't around much. He'd left us when I was pregnant, after a string of lies and betrayals I couldn't ignore anymore. For a while, I struggled with the idea of raising Lily on my own. Then James came into our lives, a man who didn't shy away from responsibility. He was steady, supportive, and most importantly, he loved Lily as if she were his own daughter. And for years, that was enough. It was enough for me to believe that we had created something real, something that would last. But as the years went by, something started to change. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing I could point to and say, that's the moment it began. But it was there, just beneath the surface. Lily had started asking questions I wasn't prepared to answer. Questions about her father, about why she didn't look like James, about why she didn't have the same last name as him. I brushed them off, telling her that it didn't matter, that family isn't about blood. But deep down, I knew that those questions were a sign of something I couldn't hide forever. I kept telling myself it would be okay, that with time, Lily would grow to see James as her dad, not because of biology, but because of the love they shared. I wanted to believe that the bond they had built would be enough to erase the past. But I could see the doubts forming in Lily's eyes whenever she compared herself to James or asked about Mark. And I knew that one day, she would say something that would force me to confront the truth. That day came on a Saturday morning, just like any other. I had just poured the syrup onto the pancakes when I heard Lily's voice call out from the living room. She was talking to James, and for a moment, it sounded like a typical conversation between them. But then her words stopped me in my tracks. "You're not my real dad," Lily said, her voice loud and clear. I froze. The syrup bottle trembled in my hands, and I could feel the warmth in my cheeks as I realized what she had just said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement. She had just spoken the truth as she understood it, and in that moment, my world seemed to come crashing down. I heard James laugh awkwardly, trying to brush off her words, but I could hear the strain in his voice. I knew what he was thinking, what he was feeling in that moment. He was confused, hurt, and perhaps even a little afraid. He loved her with all his heart, but here was this tiny person, his daughter in every way that mattered, telling him that he wasn't her real father. I stood there, paralyzed. My hands shook, and the pancakes on the stove began to burn. I couldn't bring myself to turn around and face them. I couldn't bring myself to face James, whose love I had always believed was enough to erase any doubts, and I couldn't face Lily, whose innocence and honesty had exposed a painful truth I had kept hidden for so long. I had always thought I could protect them from the complexities of our past. I had always thought that the love between James and Lily would transcend biology, that the bonds they formed over the years would be enough to make her see him as her dad. But in that moment, it became clear to me that there was more to the story than I had ever wanted to admit. James was silent now, waiting for me to say something, anything. But I couldn't. I couldn't say the words that were sitting heavy on my chest. I couldn't tell him that I had never told him the full truth about Lily's biological father, about Mark, about the man who had walked away from us when we needed him the most. I couldn't say the words that would change everything, because I was terrified of what it would mean for us. The room felt heavy, the air thick with unspoken words. And there I stood, holding a bottle of syrup in my hand, unable to speak the truth. The silence in the room was unbearable. The clinking of utensils against plates, the soft murmur of the television in the background, everything seemed louder than usual, louder because of the words Lily had just spoken. "You're not my real dad." I could still hear her voice echoing in my ears, and for the first time in years, the weight of the truth felt like it was too much to carry. James was trying to laugh it off, his voice forced and shaky. "Come on, sweetie, you know I'm your dad." But there was a vulnerability in his tone that I had never heard before. He looked at me, waiting for me to step in, to make everything right again. But I couldn't. I didn't know how. Lily wasn't upset when she said it. She wasn't angry or sad. It was just a simple, childlike observation, something she had said so many times before, only this time, it felt like it carried more weight. The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, I thought I might suffocate under the pressure of it all. I wanted to say something to James. I wanted to explain, to reassure him that everything was fine, that this was just one of those things kids say without fully understanding. But I couldn't. The words stuck in my throat. James looked at me, his eyes searching mine, desperate for an explanation. But how could I explain? How could I tell him that I had kept this secret for so long, that I had never told him the full truth about Lily's father? How could I tell him that Lily wasn't biologically his, that the man who had been in her life since she was a toddler wasn't her real father? I saw the hurt in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was confusion. He wanted to know if what Lily had said was true, if she was right about him not being her real father. And the longer I stood there, frozen in place, the more I realized that I had failed him. Lily, oblivious to the tension in the room, picked up her toy and went back to playing. But I could see the change in James. He wasn't the same man he had been moments before. The love he had for her was still there, but now it felt fragile, like something that could break at any moment. I saw him trying to process what had just happened, trying to make sense of the confusion that had suddenly appeared in our lives. For a long time, we had avoided this conversation. I had avoided it because I didn't know how to explain the complexity of it all. How could I explain to James that I had been protecting him from a painful truth, a truth I didn't know how to face myself? How could I tell Lily that the man she loved, the man she called Dad, wasn't her biological father? How could I explain that love isn't always about blood, that family isn't always defined by genetics? James cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Emma, is she right?" His voice was barely above a whisper, and the weight of the question hung heavily between us. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't meet his eyes. Instead, I focused on the pancakes on the stove, watching the edges burn as I stood there, paralyzed by my own fear of the truth. I don't know how to explain, I muttered, my voice shaky. But it's complicated. The words barely escaped my lips, but they were enough to confirm what he already feared. He wasn't the one who needed me to explain. It was me who needed to admit the truth, to him, to myself, and to our daughter. But I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to destroy the life we had built. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just lying to James, I was lying to myself, too. After that morning, things felt different. The silence between James and I was palpable, more so than it had ever been before. I could feel the weight of the secret pressing down on me, and the more I tried to push it away, the harder it became to breathe. Every time I looked at James, I saw the question in his eyes, the one he hadn't asked out loud yet, but I could hear it echoing in the silence. Why didn't you tell me? The days that followed were filled with tense conversations, quiet meals, and moments where we both avoided speaking of what had happened. Lily, as children do, quickly moved on from the incident, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing between her parents. She had been too young to understand the gravity of her words, too innocent to see the cracks that had begun to form in our once perfect family. But James wasn't so naive. He had always been perceptive, always quick to read between the lines. I knew it wasn't going to take long before he demanded an explanation. And the longer I waited to give him one, the harder it became to speak the truth. One night, after Lily had gone to bed, James and I found ourselves alone in the living room. The silence was suffocating, and I could feel the tension crackling in the air. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look upset. He just looked tired. Tired of pretending, tired of holding back the question that had been on his mind for days. "Emma," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I need to know. Is it true? Is Lily right?" I had been waiting for this moment, yet when it came, I felt like I was choking on my own words. There was no avoiding it anymore. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the vulnerability in the way he looked at me, and I knew I couldn't keep lying to him. I took a deep breath, the air feeling thick in my chest. "James," I began, my voice trembling, "Lily's biological father is not you." I could see the moment the words hit him, the way his face tightened in shock. His eyes flickered with confusion and hurt, and for a brief second, I saw a flash of disbelief. "Then why?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Why didn't you tell me?" I swallowed hard, trying to gather the strength to continue. "Because I was scared," I admitted, my eyes filling with tears. "I was scared that you wouldn't love her the same way if you knew the truth. I was scared that I would lose you." James ran a hand through his hair, clearly processing the revelation. "But I already love her, Emma. I've always loved her. She's my daughter, no matter what." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I know. I know you do. And I didn't want to ruin that. I didn't want to risk losing the family we had built." For a moment, we both sat there in silence, the weight of the conversation hanging between us. I could see that James was struggling to process everything. He had always thought that Lily was his daughter, his responsibility, his family. And now that truth had been shattered. "I don't understand," he whispered. "Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me?" I couldn't answer him immediately. The truth was, I didn't trust myself enough to tell him. I had kept the secret for so long that it had become a part of me, and revealing it felt like unraveling everything I had worked so hard to build. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I should have told you sooner. I should have trusted you." James looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached out and took my hand. "I need time to process this," he said quietly. "But I'm not going anywhere, Emma. I'm not leaving you. I just need to think." And in that moment, I knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The trust between us had been fractured, and healing would take time. But at least now, the truth was out. At least now, we could begin the painful process of rebuilding. The days that followed our conversation felt like they stretched on forever. It was as if everything in our life had come to a standstill, suspended in the painful aftermath of the truth. James and I rarely spoke, only exchanging necessary words. The once warm and loving home felt cold, and I could feel the distance between us growing with each passing day. I had shattered the image of our family, and now I wasn't sure how to put it back together. Lily, completely oblivious to the changes in our dynamic, went about her days as usual. She was young, too young to understand the weight of what had happened. I had tried to reassure her, to tell her that everything was fine, but inside, I felt the cracks forming deeper than ever. How could I explain to her that the man she called Dad might not feel the same about her now? How could I protect her from this heartbreak when I was the one who had caused it? James, on the other hand, retreated into himself. I could see the hurt in his eyes every time he looked at me, but he never voiced it directly. It was as if he was trying to make sense of it all, but the pieces just weren't fitting together. I knew he needed time, but I wasn't sure how much time we had left before the distance between us became permanent. One evening, after dinner, I sat down with him, hoping for a breakthrough. I needed to find a way back to the person we used to be, to the love we had shared before this secret had torn us apart. "James," I started, my voice quiet but determined, "I know things have been hard. I know I've hurt you, and I can't undo that. But I need you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen. I love you, and I love Lily. I didn't know how to handle the truth. I didn't know how to tell you." James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the floor, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. The silence between us was thick, but this time, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt like a pause, a moment where we could finally start to heal. "I don't know how to feel right now," he said, his voice low and raw. "I love her. I've loved her like she was my own. But knowing that she's not, it's hard. It's hard to figure out where I stand now." I reached out to touch his hand, my fingers trembling. "I understand. I didn't want to take that away from you. But she's still yours, James. She's still the same Lily. Nothing changes that." He met my gaze, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "But does she know that? Does she know that I'm her dad, even if we're not connected by blood?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken for too long. I had never thought about it that way before. I had assumed that love was enough, that Lily didn't need to know the details, but now I saw the cracks forming in her perception of the world. Would she ever understand that love isn't defined by biology, that family is about who's there for you no matter what? "She knows," I said softly, "but she needs time too. She needs to understand that love isn't just about blood. It's about the people who show up, who care, who stay. And that's you, James. You've been there for her since the very beginning." James's eyes softened, the walls he had built around himself starting to come down. "I don't know if I'm ready to fully forgive you yet. But I want to try. For her. For us." I felt a glimmer of hope in that moment, a flicker of the future that we might still have together. It wasn't going to be easy. Rebuilding trust, repairing the damage I had caused, would take time. But in that moment, I realized that we were both willing to try. And that, for now, was enough. It had been months since the truth had come out, and in that time, I had seen the love between James and Lily grow in ways I hadn't expected. The road to healing was long and difficult, but it was also filled with small victories, moments of connection, understanding, and forgiveness. We were no longer the same people we were before the secret had torn us apart, but we were something stronger, something new. James had slowly opened up, and through his vulnerability, I saw a side of him I hadn't fully known before. He wasn't just the man I had married, he was a father, someone who could love beyond blood, who could give his whole heart to a child who wasn't his own. And Lily, in her own way, was coming to terms with the truth. She had always been intuitive, and as she grew older, she began to ask questions about her biological father, about what it meant to have two people love her as much as James did. It wasn't always easy for her, and sometimes I caught her staring at James with a look I couldn't quite decipher, but in her eyes, I saw trust, the kind of trust that could only come from time. One evening, as we sat together on the couch after dinner, Lily climbed into James's lap, resting her head on his shoulder. I watched them, my heart swelling with emotion. They had worked through the awkwardness, the uncertainty, and now, they were a team. A family, in every sense of the word. "I'm glad you're my dad," Lily said quietly, her voice full of sincerity. It was a simple statement, but it was one that carried so much weight. I didn't know if she understood how much that meant to both of us, but I saw the smile on James's face, the way his eyes softened, and I knew that the words had hit their mark. "I'm glad you're mine," James replied, kissing the top of her head. His voice was thick with emotion, and I saw the depth of his love in that moment. I had never thought I'd see the day when the rift between us would heal. There had been times when I doubted it, when I thought the damage was too great, the pain too deep. But love had found a way, even in the most unexpected of places. And now, as I watched James and Lily together, I knew that the journey hadn't been in vain. Things weren't perfect, of course. There were still moments of doubt, still times when the past would resurface and threaten to undo the progress we had made. But we had learned to face those moments together, to communicate honestly, to understand that healing takes time, and sometimes, healing isn't linear. I turned to James, meeting his gaze, and for the first time in months, I saw something I had missed: peace. The tension that had once hung between us had lifted, replaced by a quiet understanding. We didn't need to say much, we knew where we stood, and we knew we had each other's backs. "We've made it through," I whispered, my voice filled with awe. James nodded, his hand finding mine. "We're not perfect, Emma. But we're us. And that's all that matters." In that moment, I realized that the secret I had kept, the truth I had feared would destroy us, had instead led to something beautiful. It had forced us to confront our deepest fears and come out stronger on the other side. We were a family, bound not just by blood, but by love, the kind of love that doesn't give up, the kind that fights through the toughest storms. And as we sat there, together, I knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter for us. We had come through the darkness, and now, we could finally see the light.